Want to know who the bad guy in a movie is? Keep an eye out for characters that don't use an iPhone.
Apple, they let you use iPhones in movies, and this is very pivotal if you're ever watching a mystery movie, bad guys cannot have iPhones on camera.
I'm not kidding. Apple wants to be showcased in the best light, even if it is in movies with fictional characters. Was this necessary? Well, that's debatable. But when you've built an empire, a 2.4 trillion empire at that, from the early Macintosh to the latest iPhones, you would also want to protect it from anything and everything. So what goes into making this empire? And more importantly, sustaining it for almost 4 decades. Apple has been one of the most valuable companies for the past 40 years, but its share prices have only risen around the past decade. Now, to understand this, let's go way back to 1976.
My Apple is my manager.
Apple computer.
This is my Apple.
Apple, the most personal computer.
This is the Apple II. It was designed in 1977 by Steve Wozniak and marketed by Steve Jobs. At that time, it was conventional to have a PC with different components, such as the keyboard and the power supply sold separately. Steve realized that Apple II needed to be different. He decided to have it pre-assembled with a built-in keyboard. This made it the first Apple product to achieve mass market success. But there was still a part of the puzzle missing. You see, Apple II was not very powerful for seasoned computer professionals. They were used to using much more powerful computers from companies like IBM and DEC. This was when programmer Dan Brickling created VisiClap in 1979, the first spreadsheet program for Apple II. After this, there was no looking back for Apple. It was a hit on the business side and its sales skyrocketed. Its sales were only beaten by Apple's own Macintosh in 1984. The computer interface that we see today, the one with windows, menus, icons, this was first developed at the Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center in the 1970s. Macintosh developed these ideas and implemented them in their interface. While the first model of the Macintosh wasn't very powerful, its subsequent models had cracked it. Apple also brought color to the Macintosh with the Macintosh 2 in 1987. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, or so thought Microsoft. It borrowed heavily from the ideas of Macintosh, which led to Apple suing Microsoft in. But Microsoft largely prevailed. Over the year, the Mac just got better and better and better, attracting a loyal audience who now just couldn't do without a Mac. Apple was run by the brightest minds of the century, but they still needed money to get projects like the Apple II off the ground. This is when Jobs and Wozniak sold majority of the company's board seats to investors. Pepsi executive John Scully came on board in 1983. Steve and Scully had a lot of bad blood and clashed frequently, until 1985, when Scully got the board to oust Jobs. With Steve's vision gone from Apple, it no longer had any edge over the cheaper PCs. Its technology began to show its age, and it lacked the innovation that attracted customers to it in the first place. Jobs, on the other hand, started another company called Next, that despite being a technological marvel in its products, did not have the affordability that came with scale. Now, with Apple's business dwindling, the CEO, Gil Amelio, had no choice but to acquire Next for $400 million in 1997 and give Jobs the control of the company. It was then that Apple did a 360. Jobs converted the $1 billion loss in 1997 into a $300 million profit in 1998. And then came a flurry of products that made Apple boom again. After Jobs died in 2011, Tim Cook, Apple's longtime deputy, took over. Arguably, these were big shoes to fill. But Cook never tried to emulate Jobs in his management style. On the contrary, he did things a lot differently than Jobs would have done. This is because Apple had established itself as an innovative tech company under Jobs. It was good in that front, which meant that it already had a loyal customer base. Now what the company needed was to be seen as a dependable company. And this is what Cook did in his tenure as CEO. You see, he started from the basics. Jobs was obsessive about having each detail of each product or service rendered by Apple. Cook loosened the reins and decentralized the way of operating things. This meant operations were a lot faster and a lot more was getting done. For instance, there were many more mergers and acquisitions under Cook, since not everything needed to go through him. The way they dealt with acquisitions was also very different. Jobs would completely acquire a company and not allow it to run as an independent subsidiary, whereas Cook would acquire the company while letting it run independently, as was the case with Beats. Cook's focus on value is another huge factor in Apple's goodwill increasing. He focused on the environment, factory working conditions, the advancement of health measurements, and much more. Things that Apple typically wasn't focused on. Another huge impact that Cook had was on the importance of privacy. This affects how Apple treats user data, which is why tech giants like Facebook were caught up in the data privacy breaches, but not Apple.
Apple and encryption back in the headlines with Attorney General Barr claiming the company has been unhelpful in the FBI's investigation of the Pensacola Air Base shooting.
We have asked Apple for their help in unlocking the shooter's phones. So far, Apple has not given any substantive assistance.
In fact, it even refused to give user data to the law enforcement. He also widened the Apple accessories market since he joined, which contributed in pumping up its revenue, eventually leading the wearables market. Other than this, he also set out to take several green initiatives that increased the company's goodwill further and cater to the expectation that people had of tech giants. Cook has steadily increased the ROI numbers in the last 20 years, which is a measure of how efficiently he has used the capital at hand. All these factors led to the share price of Apple steadily increasing by almost 10 times since Cook took over. Now, Apple has been one of the pioneers in innovative thinking in the tech space. Despite its ups and downs, it has thrived for over 30 years and still stands as one of the biggest companies in the world. When the company needed a disruptor, it had Jobs on the driver's seat. And when it came to stabilizing the company, Cook took over. The direction of this tech giant today is upward and onward. Apple is here to stay.